On a quiet summer afternoon, a beautiful princess was strolling through the lush green forest near the palace. She wore a stunning golden dress that shimmered in the sunlight, standing out in the verdant surroundings. In her hand, she held a sparkling golden ball, her favorite toy that she always carried with her when playing outdoors. She joyfully tossed the ball into the air and caught it. But unfortunately, in a moment of carelessness, the golden ball slipped from her hands and fell into a deep well nearby. Panicking, the princess rushed to the well, peering down to see the golden ball sinking deep into the water. She was worried and saddened as it was her most treasured possession. Sitting by the well, tears streamed down her face. In her moment of despair, she suddenly heard a strange voice from below. "Beautiful princess, why are you crying?" Startled, the princess looked around and discovered a small green frog sitting by the edge of the well. She was amazed to see that the frog could speak. The frog continued, "If you make me a promise, I will help you retrieve your golden ball from the well." In her desperation, the princess didn't think long and agreed right away, even though she didn't yet know what the frog would ask of her. The frog then jumped into the well, diving deep into the cool water, and in just a moment, the frog emerged with the golden ball in its mouth, returning it to the princess. The princess was overjoyed, but as soon as she held the ball in her hands, the frog reminded her, "Remember, you made me a promise, and you must keep that promise." The princess, feeling uneasy and not sure what the promise would entail, reluctantly agreed and took the golden ball back to the palace. After retrieving her golden ball from the frog by the well, the princess hurried back to the palace, not paying much attention to the promise she had made to the frog. However, that evening, as the princess was having dinner with her father, the king, and the courtiers in the grand dining hall, a sudden knock was heard at the door. A small voice called from outside, "Beautiful princess, open the door. Remember your promise." The princess was startled, realizing it was the voice of the frog, to whom she had promised to bring back to the palace. Her heart filled with dread and reluctance. She didn't want to fulfill her promise to the frog, but she had no choice. Reluctantly, she went to the door and opened it. As the door opened, the frog slowly hopped into the palace, looking up at her expectantly. The frog reminded the princess of the promise she had made, that he would eat with her, sleep in her palace, and become her companion. The princess, though filled with discomfort and frustration, couldn't refuse because she knew she had made a promise and could not break it. She brought the frog to the large dining table where the royal family was dining. All eyes turned to the small frog sitting beside the princess. She felt awkward and uncomfortable having to eat dinner with a frog, but her promise forced her to maintain composure and respect the agreement. The frog, with polite and gentle manners, ate alongside the princess and made no unreasonable demands. However, inside the princess, her irritation grew as she felt increasingly uneasy with the frog's presence. Nevertheless, she continued to fulfill her promise, knowing that this was an important lesson in honesty and responsibility. That evening, in the grand and luxurious dining room of the palace, the princess sat at the long table beside her father, the king, and the courtiers. The dinner was lavishly prepared with delicious and exquisite dishes. However, the atmosphere became tense when the frog, whom the princess had promised to bring to the palace, arrived and sat at the dining table. Reluctantly, the princess placed the frog on the table. Her eyes were filled with discomfort and unease as she sat next to a frog during her meal. Everyone in the room looked at the frog with surprise and curiosity, unable to understand why the princess had to dine with such a small creature. The frog, though small, was polite and courteous, sitting before his plate and beginning to eat with the princess. Each time the frog hopped slightly to reach the food, The princess felt more uncomfortable. However, remembering the promise she had made, she had no choice but to remain silent and continue with the meal. The princess tried to stay calm, but her irritation grew stronger with each passing moment. She couldn't understand why she had to endure this situation, and she was even more frustrated by the fact that a frog was dining with her at the royal banquet table. The frog made no additional demands, simply eating with grace and calmness. This made the princess begin to reconsider her feelings. Although the frog wasn't the dining companion she had expected, he had helped her retrieve her beloved golden ball, and he hadn't done anything to inconvenience her. The princess started to realize that keeping her promise was important, and although dining with the frog was uncomfortable, this was a lesson she needed to learn about honesty and honoring commitments. After the uncomfortable dinner, the princess hoped that she had fulfilled her promise and that the frog would leave. However, the frog reminded her of the final promise to let him sleep on her soft royal bed. Hearing this, the princess became even more annoyed and frustrated. She couldn't imagine having to share her bed with a frog. As night fell and the princess prepared for bed, the frog hopped onto her bed as promised. The princess became increasingly angry, feeling she couldn't tolerate it anymore. In disgust and irritation, she forcefully pushed the frog off the bed, causing him to fall to the floor. The princess shouted, "I don't want you here. You're just an ugly, dirty frog. You don't deserve to sleep in my bed." The frog lay there, silent and saddened, but said nothing in response. Though the princess was furious, she also felt a twinge of regret for her actions. But her anger and disgust were too strong for her to do anything but turn her back. However, just as she turned away, something magical happened. From the spot where the frog had fallen, a brilliant light began to shine, illuminating the room. The princess turned back and was astonished to see the frog slowly transforming. Under the radiant light, the frog was gone, and in his place stood a handsome prince, tall and kind, looking at her with forgiveness. Right after the princess forcefully pushed the frog off the bed and turned away, she felt the atmosphere in the room suddenly change. A radiant light began to shine from the spot where the frog had fallen. The light was so bright that the royal room was filled with a magical glow. The princess, shocked and curious, slowly turned around, her eyes widening at the unexpected sight before her. Where the small frog had been lying, his tiny form had disappeared, and in its place stood a tall, handsome prince. The prince's appearance glowed in the magical light. Dressed in elegant royal robes, his eyes gentle and kind. The prince slowly stood up, looking at the princess with a warm smile. Showing no sign of anger or resentment, the princess couldn't believe her eyes. She stepped back in amazement, overwhelmed by the incredible transformation that had just occurred. The prince approached her gently and said, "I am a prince who was cursed and turned into a frog, waiting for a brave princess to keep her promise. Thanks to you, the curse has been broken, and I can return to my true form." The princess, still in shock, began to realize that everything she had just experienced was not only a test of patience and honesty, but also a magical story full of surprises. Looking at the prince, she felt a change in her heart, from disgust toward the frog to admiration and respect for the prince standing before her. With kindness and forgiveness, the prince thanked the princess for helping him break the curse. The princess, feeling a bit embarrassed by her earlier actions, finally smiled and accepted the truth that she had helped free the prince. After the prince's curse was broken and the frog transformed into a handsome prince, the lives of the princess and the prince changed completely. They returned to the palace, where the king and courtiers were astonished and delighted to learn of the magical story. The prince and the princess were now longer strangers but had become companions, who understood and respected each other. As time passed in the palace, the prince and the princess spent more time together, sharing stories and laughter. They learned how to work together and support each other in every decision and challenge in life. The princess, having experienced so much, became more mature, compassionate, and understanding. The prince, with his calmness and kindness, was always a source of strength for the princess. Together, they built a happy life, not based on power or magic, but on honesty, forgiveness, and love. On beautiful afternoons, they would walk hand in hand through the royal gardens, admiring the blooming flowers and listening to the birds singing. Their story didn't end with magic, but became a symbol of growth and learning in life. Both had faced trials and hardships, but through patience, sincerity, and kindness, they found true happiness. Under the shimmering sunlight streaming through the palace windows, the prince and princess smiled at each other, their hearts filled with joy. Love and understanding had brought them lasting happiness, and they became the symbol of a